Welcome everyone to the second of our Tuesday seminars. I'm delighted to, after our wonderful first session where we made our own, Tim Flanders and his collaborators worked very hard. We now show the lesson to our visiting fellows that we also made them work very hard. And we have the first visiting fellow this year, visiting academic Professor Yascha Mounk, who joins us from Johns Hopkins University, where he's a professor of practice. And so he's a colleague of mine twice in Oxford and at Johns Hopkins University. And he originally was raised in Munich, came from Germany, did his undergraduate degree in history at Trinity College, Cambridge, before he did a PhD at Harvard under the supervision of Michael Sandel. His PhD was published by Harvard University Press. It was on personal responsibility and democracy, which is a theme that probably touches all of us. But today he presents a wonderful second book, which came out, or third, or whatever it is, your second? Fourth, I'm underselling him. The fourth book, which came out in April, and I wanted to put it up and show it, but we didn't have it here. Look it up, but it's The Great Experiment, Why Diverse Democracies Fall Apart and How They Can Endure. Yascha, we are extremely delighted to have you here for the whole term, but in particular for the evening where we make you work very, very hard. So welcome, Professor Yascha.
Thanks so much for the 10 minutes introduction. I've been told to talk for about 45 or so minutes, which feels like a long time. So that's why I just moved the table aside, because I feel like at least I can stand and create a little bit of dynamism.
Whoever has been trained by Michael Sandel will walk around.
Well, Michael has a couple other tricks up his sleeve. I can try and emulate them. I wasn't planning to, but let's see. So a couple of years ago, I was in Germany to promote my last book before this one, called The People versus Democracy, the German edition of that. And I gave an interview on Tagesthemen, one of the sort of big German news shows. And I was a little bit nervous because, as you mentioned, I did my undergrad in Cambridge in English, and I write in English mostly. And, while German is my mother tongue, I didn't really, I always get a little bit more nervous when I do interviews in German because I feel like I'm not as precise in the words I choose and so on. And the first question that I was asked, thankfully, was about the reasons for the rise of populism, which is very squarely within the ambit of the book. And so I tried to say that I think there's three primary reasons, which have to do with the stagnation of living standards for ordinary citizens from one generation to the next, which have to do with the rise of the internet and of social media and the way it makes it easier for the outsiders to sort of enter the political system. And thirdly, I said, it has to do with the sort of great experiment that we're now undergoing. And I didn't really plan to use that term, it just sort of came out in that moment. And the great experiment, I said, was the sort of way in which we are turning mono-ethnic, monocultural countries into more multi-ethnic ones. That will create a lot of problems for them. But ultimately, I think we will manage to deal with those problems and democracies can thrive and succeed. There was a few more questions after that. I felt on sort of relatively safe ground after I fixed that a little bit. I went to an airport hotel and fell asleep and sort of took the plane to the US the next morning. And when I switched on my phone when I arrived, and the phone just wouldn't stop ringing. And if that's ever happened to you, that usually it's not a sign of good news. And so I thought, what on earth just happened? And I looked through, and it turned out that this phrase, the great experiment, and the term for therefore that I'd used had just gone sort of super viral on the far right in Germany. I was teaching at Harvard at the time, and there was all of these people on blogs like Axel des Guten, and then on various Facebook pages of politicians of the Alternative for Germany and various YouTube pages, and then eventually an article on the lovely American publication called The Daily Stormer, and so on, basically saying, this Jewish Harvard political scientist admits to conspiracy against the German people, Yascha Mounk and Angela Merkel, and trying to replace the German population. And so in a weird kind of way, that is the origin of this book project, because I started to think more deeply about the phrase I've used and the sort of outside reaction that interview had produced. And I decided that I actually want to defend the term, that the term the great experiment actually is the right way of thinking about what is happening at the moment. But of course, there's two different ways of thinking about what an experiment is. So one meaning of experiment is sort of what you might know from your chemistry lessons in high school, right, where the teacher comes in and sort of has one liquid flow into the other one, and there's an explosion, big effect, and then you're taught something about why that just happened. And hopefully, unless you had a very bad high school teacher, the chemistry teacher had a plan. He knew what would happen when he performs that experiment, and he knew what the outcome would be and what he could teach you then. That's one kind of meaning of experiment, but there's, of course, a second meaning of experiment, which is familiar to political scientists from the way we talk about the experiment of the American founding, for example, which is, as the Oxford English Dictionary says, something like embarking on a new course of action with uncertain outcome. And I think that's what we're engaged with, especially in Europe, but also in many other parts of the world, with the kind of demographic transformations that are happening within our democracies. By and large, these are historically unprecedented. We haven't seen that much demographic change through immigration and other things in the past. By and large, this is obviously one of the important differences to the theory of the great replacement. They are not consciously chosen. They are often the downstream effect of policies that were pursued in the past for completely separate reasons. In some countries, the sort of empires and colonies that have led to immigration after the collapse many decades later. In some cases, like Germany, industrial programs like that, which try to attract workers from Turkey and other countries to Germany as industrial labor, and the sort of assumption that they would someday leave again, which was never going to be realistic, which politicians believed at the time. So this isn't the result of conscious choices. It is in many ways the inadvertent downstream effect of public policies that were pursued for different reasons. But what that means fundamentally is that we are confronting an unprecedented situation without having thought carefully enough about the institutions, the policies, the norms, the ideals we need in order to make those increasingly diverse democracies succeed. And so, and by the way, there's sort of one obvious exception to this, which is North American countries like the United States and Canada, as well as certain countries in Latin America, which have always been diverse, which have always had much greater religious and ethnic heterogeneity than most European nations. But their solution to this historically has simply been a very clear ethno-religious hierarchy, in which the members of one kind of group were full citizens and had control of the political system, and the others were subordinated. And those countries are trying, imperfectly, but trying to move towards a more general form of equality, and that too is unprecedented. So in those countries, diversity is precedented, but having diversity and trying to treat all of the members of the societies as equals is also unprecedented. So what I want to do in this talk, and what I've tried to do in this book, is three things. The first is to explain why we should take the difficulty of making the great experiment succeed seriously. Why it actually, for deep reasons of history and political science, is very hard for societies that are ethnically and religiously diverse to stay together, to thrive. The second is to argue that we should nevertheless be optimistic both about the progress that these societies have made so far and about the prospects of their eventual success. In fact, I'm going to suggest it is precisely an appreciation of the difficulty of what we're currently up to, which is going to help us have a well-founded and realistic and cautious optimism about what we can achieve in the coming decades. And then finally, I want to speak a little bit about just some of the norms and ideals and policies that I think we should adopt in order for these diverse democracies to thrive. There's much more on that in the book. I'm going to keep that part of the talk relatively short today, but hopefully give you at least some ideas of the philosophically liberal principles that I believe should ground those diverse democracies. So let me start with the first part. Why is it that we should take these difficulties seriously, and what actually are these difficulties? I teach at Johns Hopkins, as Hartmut mentioned, and my student body is incredibly diverse. Actually, in the incoming freshman class at Hopkins, only about 20% of students are now white. So it's a very ethnically diverse campus and a reasonably international one as well. And my students think of themselves in many ways as some of the most tolerant people who have ever trod the surface of the earth. And in some ways, that's in fact true. But I play a fun little game with them in one of my introductory lecture courses. I ask them to debate for a few minutes whether or not a hot dog is a sandwich. And at first they look at me a little confused, and then they quickly get into the argument, and they become quite passionate about it, and they have a vote on whether a hot dog is a sandwich or not. And then I play a simple distribution game, which is to let them choose between different packages of payoffs of people who believe that a hot dog is a sandwich and those who believe that a hot dog is not a sandwich. And as you would expect from basic social psychology literature, the people who believe that a hot dog is a sandwich start to discriminate very strongly against the people who believe that a hot dog is not a sandwich, and vice versa. They're willing to take a huge cut in what members of their own group take home, just to ensure that members of the other group take home even less than that. And this, of course, is a fundamental aspect of how humans as social creatures operate. Human beings are capable of great courage, great altruism in how they treat members of their own group and how they treat people who are coded as belonging to the same grouping. But they are also capable of terrible cruelty and violence towards people who are not members of their own group. And I think that what I call this human groupishness is just a fundamental aspect of human nature that any social and political system always has to manage. It is the first difficulty in keeping a diverse democracy together. The second difficulty is that this instinct for groupishness can be triggered by all kinds of seemingly arbitrary things. It can be triggered by whether or not you believe that a hot dog is a sandwich. It can be triggered by an aspect of European history that, to my shame, I've never understood. And since we're in a European Studies Center full of very educated people here, perhaps somebody can explain it to me in the Q&A, which is the Guelphs and the Ghibellines, right? So it's all kinds of complicated enmities. But we also know from human history that there is a pattern to the kinds of traits of groups which seem to activate human groupishness most powerfully. And when you look at the long annals of human injustice and suffering, some of the most recurring themes are conflicts between groups that are organized around things like ethnicity, tribe, things like religious, theological conviction, things like language, nationhood, and of course, race and skin color. And so the second difficulty in building diverse democracies is that as societies get more diverse, this sort of Resonanzboden, this sort of set of resources you can use in order to split people into my people and not my people, my group and that group over there, just gets richer, more resonant, more powerful. I do think that makes it harder to sustain thriving, peaceful democracies and societies as you have that increase in ethnic and religious diversity. Third difficulty is one that perhaps I particularly struggled with, owning up to. I particularly struggled with making sense of, because it goes in many ways against what I would like my priors about the world to be. The others do in certain ways as well, but this one particularly is somebody who has studied democracy for a long time and has warned about the threat that populists pose to democracy and has tried to vindicate the case for liberal democracy in a difficult historical moment. And that is that I would like to think the democratic institutions are going to help us deal with that diversity. And as I'll say later in the talk, I think under the right conditions that can be true. But there is also a powerful democratic mechanism which actually makes it harder for societies to thrive, for diverse societies to thrive when they are democratic. And the logic here is very simple. If we're living in some kind of monarchy or perhaps in some kind of multinational empire, you don't have any political power, and I don't have any political power. So we both have to trust the monarch for some amount of toleration. And this means that if your group is growing for some reason, because there's more immigrants coming to the society that look like you rather than me, or you have more children than I do, or something like that, it doesn't inherently change the extent of political power I have. I had zero political power earlier, I have zero political power now. As long as I can continue to trust the monarch, the situation is stable. A democracy, and we saw that, or I saw that in part in the response to this interview of mine, is always a search for a majority. And so the idea that I used to be in the majority, but now this other group is coming in, and so therefore I might end up in the minority, and that could change everything, is in many ways tied to this fundamental democratic electoral mechanism of searching for a majority. So a lot of these kinds of conflicts can easily be exacerbated because of the electoral mechanism. So I think you take these three points together and you start to see a real case for taking the challenge of making the great experiment succeed seriously. Human beings are brutish and can easily be motivated to discriminate against members of outgroups. One particularly salient characteristic which often motivates people is ethnic or religious or linguistic distinction, and those obviously proliferate in a more diverse society whose demographics changing quickly. And our basic political form that we want to keep for all kinds of other reasons, democracy and the electoral mechanism, actually in some ways makes it easier to exploit those kinds of fear, makes it easier for people to think, hang on a second, these changes are an existential threat to me. That helps to explain the rise of conspiracy theories like the Great Replacement and the appeal of parts of the far right. So hopefully I've depressed you somewhat by this point. But I'm going to try and cheer you up. I'm not sure I'll succeed in that. The depressing part is always more convincing. No, because actually in some ways I set out to write a book because I realized that my basic position at the moment is unfashionably optimistic. Now, partially that's because I was one of the first people to warn about the instability of democracy in countries like the United States, but I think people have overlearned the lesson, and they've gone from, as was the case 10 years ago when I was a graduate student, basically saying democracy in a country like the United States is stable forever and we don't have to worry about it at all. Too often, at least in the media, talking as though democracy is already doomed and there's be no hope. So rather than understanding that there isn't a deterministic account of the future, but it will depend on choices and actions and so on, which are partially within our agency, we've simply flipped the conventional wisdom from a naive optimism to, I think, sometimes an overstated cynicism. But more specifically, because I think that there's a weird overlapping consensus of pessimism about the state of our diverse democracies from the political right, as well as the political mainstream and left. So both from sort of far-right populists and their sort of mediatic stand-ins, but also among many of my friends and colleagues and so on. So let me give you a couple of examples of that. When you look at the question like how immigrants are doing in society, you obviously have a lot of very strongly worded pessimism from the right. This has a long tradition. In Germany, for example, you can think of somebody like Tito Sarrazin's Deutschland schafft sich ab, Germany is abolishing itself. In France, you can think of Eric Zemmour, who obviously later became a politician, a political candidate in the last presidential elections. The Suicide Français, the basic tenor of these books is to say that immigrants are coming to this country, they will never come to share our most basic values and norms. They are not succeeding on the job market. They are committing crimes at higher rates. In some books like that of Sarrazin, there's even a pretty strong insinuation, perhaps even goes beyond an insinuation, that there's something biologically inferior about immigrants, which explains their lack of success. Right? So there's this very strong tradition of anti-immigrant rhetoric on the far right. Now, obviously, within the mainstream and the left, people rightly reject this account, and they rightly say that, in particular, the suggestions of biological inferiority are disgusting and entirely unfounded. But paradoxically, you often hear echoes of the same pessimism, even though the causes of it are described in very different ways. So paradoxically, often in mainstream discourse, you also hear an emphasis on the fact that immigrants and ethnic minorities aren't able to thrive, that they're much poorer, that they really don't have any opportunity in society. But the reason for that is usually given as being sort of injustices within our society. So obviously much more plausible. That is to say, hey, actually our societies are so discriminatory and so unjust and so on, that immigrants don't really have a chance to succeed. But the paradoxical effect of that is that the ultimate description of a society is surprisingly similar, which is to say one is a relatively stagnant and stable social structure with a stable dominant group and a sort of underclass that is condemned for the foreseeable future to remain at the margins of society. So that's just one example of this confluence of different forms of pessimism. And what I found is that when you look at the changes in our societies and the state of these societies, not at sort of the headline politics. So now I'm not talking about whether or not Donald Trump will win the 2024 elections, what that might do to the American political system. But when I think about the actual changes that are going on in the heart of society, both in the United States and most Western European countries and beyond, you get to what I think is a much more optimistic picture. So let me make a few arguments in favor of that optimistic picture. One of them is that just the basic conception of how people think about a true member of society has transformed in a very significant way over the course of the last 50 or so years. So if you look at 40 or 50 years, you look at the data from the World Value Survey and other kinds of opinion polls, and it is very clear, certainly in Western Europe, that the citizens of most nations say a true German, a true Italian, a true Greek is somebody who was born in this country, somebody whose parents or grandparents, great-grandparents were already living in this country, somebody who ethnically belongs to the same nation. Then the longer the case here. Majorities in most Western European nations now recognize that you can be a full citizen of Germany and Sweden and France and so on, and the UK, if you are born in another country, if you have a different ethnicity, if you have a different religion. They say that the requirements for being a full member of a nation now are, to some extent, the legal fact of citizenship, to some extent, mastery of a language, to some extent, some kind of concordance with the basic values of the society. That is a very significant change in how people think about membership in the nation. The North American societies, of course, have always been countries of immigration. So in a way, the fact that they are willing to integrate people in that kind of way is less surprising, but they have had a very fundamental transformation in how they think about ethnic minorities within their society. So it's a very straightforward, striking fact is that about 50 years ago in the United States, 5% of Americans believed that interracial marriage was morally acceptable. 5% thought it was morally acceptable. Today, sorry? When was that? I think the early 1960s, 1961, 1962. Today, of course, it is the other way around, which is to say that so one of the striking nice little coincidences where the figure is exactly the same, it is 5% of Americans today who believe that there's something morally wrong with interracial marriage. By the way, that figure now is high among non-whites than it is among whites. Of course, you could think that this is a form of social desirability bias, that people have learned to answer as they are supposed to pollsters, and that underlying convictions haven't changed. And I'm sure that that is one part of the story. But there is also a deep transformation, which we can see very easily from census data and other sociological studies. It used to be the case that about 1 in 33 babies born in the United States had parents from different ethnic groups. Now it is about 1 in 7 or 1 in 6. So the actual change in observable behavior is very, very clear and very, very pronounced. Going beyond those opinion polls, you also see real progress on socioeconomic questions. So while one of the things that's a bugbear of mine when you look at those immigration statistics, for example, is that people tend to look at all immigrants squished together. So most of the statistics you're going to find about how immigrants are doing in Germany or France or Netherlands, country, say, well, how are people who have, as Germans probably call it, a history of migration doing in 1975 versus how are they doing today? But the problem with those studies, of course, is that they squish together people who have been in the country for 30 or 40 years, who've been born in the country, with those who have arrived 4 or 5 years ago because of a refugee crisis. And since what people are going to earn is always going to depend strongly on the quality of the primary, secondary schooling, and college, and so on, you will expect people who have come in recently from countries with, on average, much lower levels of education to not do all of that well over the course of a lifetime. So the statistic doesn't actually tell us very much about how society is going to change over time as immigrants integrate, avail themselves of opportunities that are available locally, and so on and so forth. But when you look at the relatively few studies that actually try to pass this out, the image you end up getting is much more positive. So a big study of 10 OECD countries finds that 9 of them, the children and the grandchildren of immigrants, have a much higher likelihood of rising up the educational ladder and increasing their financial earnings than the children and the grandchildren of similarly situated non-immigrant ancestors. In other words, the gap between immigrants and non-immigrants is significantly closer. And in the United States, we have a great study by economists at Princeton, Stanford, and a couple of other institutions, over 1 million data points, which show that the speed with which immigrants today from countries, including El Salvador and Vietnam and Kenya and other places, are integrating in society, making socioeconomic progress in society, is pretty much exactly the same as it was for Irish immigrants and Italian immigrants a century ago. It is a slow process, right? It doesn't usually work in the first generation. It's not completed by the second generation. But this multi-generational process is continuing to work very strongly, and it is about the same speed as it was 100 years ago. Now, obviously, that shows, somewhat needlessly for this audience, but it shows importantly that the far-right pessimism about immigrants is mistaken, that these immigrants from El Salvador and Vietnam and Kenya are just as capable of succeeding as Italian and Irish immigrants were a century ago. But I think it also puts a little bit of pressure on the more mainstream narrative that these immigrants face so much racism and so much discrimination, so much exclusion, that because they're non-white, they cannot succeed in the way that those Irish and Italian immigrants did. Again, obviously there is racism and discrimination in the United States today. Obviously there is an obstacle, but clearly many of these immigrants are actually able to overcome that, and that's something that we should also be able to recognize and in fact celebrate. The last point is more long-standing ethnic minorities within liberal democracies. So we see in the United States that immigrant groups from some non-white countries are thriving to an extreme extent. A couple of striking statistics about that. Asian women in the United States, on average, now make more than white men, which is an interesting finding. And immigrant groups, especially from countries that have typically H-1B immigration, but interesting nevertheless, like India, like China, but also Nigeria and Kenya, vastly out-earn white Americans. So actually, Kenyan Americans, Nigerian Americans, both make over $100,000 a year on average household income. Household income among white Americans is around $60,000. But of course, one of the fundamental problems with which diverse democracies have to deal is when they have population groups that have been oppressed and dominated within those countries for a very long time. Those are the groups that often struggle the most to make socioeconomic progress. And the most obvious example of that is African Americans in the United States. Now, what we see when we look carefully at those statistics is a very shocking wealth disparity, which has not yet started to budge as much as we would like. An income disparity, which is much narrower and is starting to move much more quickly. For obvious reasons, income disparities are quicker to change than wealth disparities. We see that the median African American is actually doing very well. Those past days thriving. So you see that the median African American now lives in a suburb rather than either in inner city or a sort of rural area in the American South, as the cliche might go. Median African American has a white collar job as a teacher or perhaps a nurse or perhaps somebody else in the medical profession or the teaching profession and so on. They have employer-sponsored healthcare, which is always a good sort of signal of the high quality-ish job in the United States. And interestingly, they, like Latinos, by the way, are more optimistic about the future and more optimistic about the American dream than white Americans are today. At the same time, what you have is a significant percentage of African Americans that continue, because of the compounded disadvantage they have suffered for many centuries, to live on the margins of society. 20–25% of African Americans who live in very deprived urban neighborhoods or some of those rural neighborhoods in the South, who go to schools with very high failure rates, where people don't make a great level in reading and math and so on. And that is a very significant problem that needs to be fixed, and I don't want to sugarcoat. And we need to take that problem very seriously without, therefore, like Donald Trump did in 2016, generalize to African Americans and say, as he did, vote for me, what the hell do you have to lose anyway? That, I think, is a really cynical and wrong-headed way of thinking about the condition of African Americans in that sense. All right. I could go on about this for longer, but hopefully this gives a little bit of a sense of the reason for why I think, not thinking about sort of the threat of populism, the next elections and so on, but about the changes in the heart of society, we can be a little bit more optimistic than some of the headlines would suggest. So let me hit, how many minutes am I in?
5 more minutes.
5 more minutes, or I might take 7 more minutes.
7.
Let me hit very quickly on some of the basic norms and values and ideals that I think we need in order to make those democracies thrive, and there's more detail about this in the book. So the first is that I am a philosophical liberal. I do believe that the fundamental set of values and norms that we have in our society are right. Critics of liberalism are right to point out that often these universal rules and norms aren't applied fairly in practice. I think the answer to that, however, is to strive to apply them more fully in practice, not give up on the values. The right answer to the failure of universal values and ideals to actually structure our society is not to get rid of them altogether. It is to redouble our efforts to make sure that our values actually structure the way our society is run. And I think what I've said about my optimism gives us reason to think that this is not a futile endeavor. I think societies today are much closer to living up to those universal values and ideals than they were 50 years ago. And I think that should give us the confidence to keep pushing in the same direction. I think giving up on these values is untested and is likely to lead to much worse outcome, in part because it would lead to a real power struggle, but by definition, the historical majority is more likely to win. The second point I want to make is the double freedom that I think liberal societies need to guarantee. That is to say that the 20th century has gotten us used to thinking about the state as a primary threat to individual freedom. And the state, of course, is a very important threat to individual freedom, and that continues to be the case in diverse democracy, in which the majority can often vote for what the state should do, and the state can then become a threat to unpopular minority groups. But I think that Dr Hartmut Mayer and James Robinson, in their excellent recent book, The Narrow Corridor, are right that there's a second important threat to individual freedom that we need to take seriously, and that is the threat of what we call the cage of norms. But actually, in most human societies in history, the thing that constrained your freedom was not the state and sort of the agents of the state. It was your own family, your own neighbors, your own community, your own religious community sometimes, that told you how you need to live and was able to exert very, very significant adverse consequences of you if you defied their preferences. And so what that means is that liberals should base their understanding of the basic rules that govern the way we live together on individualistic counters, to say that individual citizens and their rights and duties remain the basis of our society. This allows us in a way that it doesn't allow communitarians to say that if your own family, if your own neighbors are oppressing you, we actually have an obligation to step in and help you. But it is part and parcel of a liberalism rightly understood that groupishness is a fundamental part of human nature, that religious conviction is a fundamental part of human nature, that often a desire to honor the cultures of the ancestors is a fundamental part of human nature, and that many people will choose to partake in those groups, and that that's going to be a fundamental aspect of what life in a diverse society looks like. So liberals are capable of respecting the importance of groups, but that is always derivative of the free choices of the individuals that compose them. And the moment that individual says, I want to be out of this group, or I don't accord with what it wants me to act like, the liberal state needs to recognize an obligation to help people do that. And this is something that the alternative conception of communitarians is incapable of doing. So that's the first point. The second point is, there's been a debate about the right kind of image or metaphor for how we should think about the goal of integration of immigrants. So traditionally, it was the melting pot, the idea that we sort of take all these different influences and they sort of reflect the outcome in the end. But there's something homogeneous about the outcome, right? We come to be much more similar to each other. Then there was a very popular, especially in academic circles, counter model of a salad bowl, or something called mosaic, which essentially said that we don't have to have much in common, that we can be this sort of, as Lord Parrott put it, association of associations, in which the state simply becomes the sort of framework that holds these different groups together that have no real commonalities. I think that both of these images are a mistake. The first image, I think, is a mistake because it is too homogenizing. It asks you to give too much, or give up too much of the heritage. The second image, I think, is a mistake because it gives up too much on the possibility of having some form of generally common life and some form of generally shared culture in which we know each other and respect each other and come to have affection for each other. So I propose a counter model, a third model, which I say is that of a public park. Why the public park? Oxford has many of them. Well, private parks as well, actually, but a few public parks, I suppose. Because in a public park, if we want to continue this conversation, you and I could go and say we just want to stay among ourselves and continue this because we're not interested in meeting other people, we're not interested in talking to other people, you know, we're doing our own thing here. And that's a perfectly legitimate choice. But you can also sit there and start meeting somebody else. Perhaps if you're doing a barbecue, share food with other people and trade food and come to get to know each other and so on. These are both legitimate choices in a liberal society. You can say, I'm most going to stay among my own ethnic, religious, cultural community, or you can say, I'm going to go and encounter new citizens. But we can have an aesthetic preference, and we can have a normative preference for what society as a whole should look like. And we need a minimum number of people who make those new connections, who venture out of their own group, for this park to be appealing or for the society to thrive. So that's why I think a public park is a helpful metaphor. I know I'm testing the 7 minutes here, but I'm nearly done.
You get 3.
Well, amazing. More than enough. The third point that I want to make is to defend a conception of inclusive patriotism. I think we're seeing today in Ukraine what power patriotism can have for those of us who want to stand up for democracy and for basic rules like non-aggression in international affairs. I think it's a very powerful force for good under the right kind of circumstances. I also think of patriotism, as I argued in my last book, as a half-domesticated beast, a half-domesticated animal, whose symbolism is so strong that if those of us who want to build an inclusive society let it run fallow, let life fallow, the worst kinds of people are going to come in and till that field. I'm really mixing the metaphors right now. And so, going back to the metaphor of the half-domesticated beast, they can stoke it and provoke it until it runs wild. And the best defense against that is actually to try as best we can to domesticate it. Patriotism will always remain somewhat dangerous, but that is the best we can do. And it can have this really positive effect as well. But the question then becomes, what should this patriotism look like? And here there are 2 traditional conceptions. The first is an ethnic nationalism, which sets up a definition of a true Italian as somebody whose ancestors were Italian and so on. And for obvious and relatively boring reasons, I reject that ethnic conception of nationalism. The second conception, which is much more appealing, is a civic or constitutional patriotism. Is a patriotism which says that what defines an American or what defines a French person, these are countries where there's particularly powerful castle constitution, defines an Indian, it's also strong in the 1948 Indian Constitution, is a set of shared values and a shared commitment to a particular set of institutions that is going to governance. Now that's very powerful to me. Insofar as I have a deep sense of patriotism about a country like the United States, where I've spent part of my life, it is on those kinds of civic grounds. So I think civic patriotism should absolutely be a part of the inclusive patriotism I'm arguing for. But I don't think it's sufficient. And it's insufficient for 2 reasons. The first is a philosophical reason, and that is that patriotism, by definition, is a love of something specific and particular. It's a love of this thing, but not that thing. But the basic rules and norms and ideals that underwrite liberal democratic constitutions are actually very similar. They're not that different between Britain and the United States and Australia and Germany and Austria. The difference between some of them, right? But there's a real set of shared values. But it would be very odd if Britain decided for some reason to codify its constitution and it ended up with a constitution that's identical to the Austrian constitution. Those of you in this room who are British and who feel some form of patriotism are not suddenly going to become Austrian patriots. So I think there's a kind of logical flaw in how people tend to think about civic patriotism. The most straightforward argument against the sufficiency of patriotism, civic patriotism, is simply that most people don't care that much about politics. That all of us are weird because we're in a seminar room on a lovely day talking about politics, and most people are not weird and they don't talk about politics all the time. And when they think about why they love the country, they're not thinking, even in the United States, of the Declaration of Independence and the Bill of Rights and the Constitution. And so I actually want to defend a second element to a healthy inclusive patriotism, which is a cultural patriotism. That cultural patriotism does not need to be rooted in the past. It does not need to be about the costumes that people wore as they descended the Mayflower, or about the lovely history of Oxford or anything like that. It can be some part of it, but it's not the principal aspect of it. It's actually a love of the cities and the landscapes, the sounds and the smells, the cultural customs, cultural scripts which govern how we interact here, that you have in your society. And those, I want to suggest, actually have become deeply diverse. But if you look at the lived reality today of a country like the United States, like Germany, like Sweden, and many other democracies, the lived culture of those countries is dynamic, has started to reflect in many important ways the contributions of immigrants, of ethnic minorities, of religious minorities, of people who don't belong to the historical majority. And that opens the way for cultural patriotism, which can be a healthy element of the kind of sense of mutual solidarity and common purpose that we should try and cultivate in order to make a great experiment work. I have the excuse of running out of time for not answering the 17 other questions that I could address, but I trust that you're going to put them to me in a minute.